There's also the issue with the media, which I talked about this last night. This is a wild story, but The Intercept actually reported this. It says CNN runs Gaza coverage past Jerusalem team operating under the shadow of an IDF censor. So it turns out that The Intercept reported that apparently CNN all this time, not actually starting with October 7th, the article says that they've been doing this for years. They have been running their coverage, anything that has to deal with Israel, running that coverage through Jerusalem first before they publish it. And I want to get your take about that as someone who's a part of, obviously, independent media. How do you feel about the fact that here we have mainstream media where YouTube will tell you that they are actually real news, and they are basically getting the approval of the IDF before they publish stories about Israel, which obviously means that their stories in reference to Israel and Gaza is going to be biased?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't share the article because it wasn't revelatory to me. I'm glad that someone did it. The Intercept published it. But CNN has been putting openly Zionist anchors like Jake Tapper and Dana Bash and Wolf Blitzer, who is a former staffer for AIPAC, the key arm of the Israel lobby. They've been putting them out front since October 7th to openly shill for Israel and its assault on Gaza. So it's like what I found here was not surprising at all, including that CNN hired on a freelance basis an active duty Israeli soldier to file reports. That doesn't surprise me because look at the New York Times. I mean, the New York Times is, it makes more of an effort to seem balanced on this issue than CNN, which is just a straight up outsourced press operation for the Israeli Foreign Ministry at this point. The New York Times bureau is in a house that I visited in Jerusalem that was stolen from a Palestinian family, the Karmi family. Hassan Karmi was the bureau chief for BBC Arabic in 1948 when Israeli troops came and drove him out of his neighborhood in Jerusalem. His daughter, Ghada Karmi, is one of the most famous Palestinian activists in the UK. And Thomas Friedman in the 1980s purchased this stolen Arab home that belonged to the Karmi family and made it the New York Times bureau, and it remains such today. And the New York Times bureau chief in Jerusalem, Isabel Kirshner, is an Israeli, as far as I know, and has had a son in the Israeli army. So she's writing all their copy. She absorbs all the anxieties that are familiar to Jewish Israelis. And she's posing as this objective reporter for the newspaper of record. Former bureau chief at the New York Times, Ethan Bronner, also had a son in the Israeli army. He's now the, Israel bureau chief and senior editor for the Middle East at Bloomberg News. Then David Brooks, this neocon New York Times columnist, his son is active in the Israeli army. And actually his unit, according to David Brooks, took many losses on October 7th. So it just the whole system of Zionism and the ideology of Zionism is deeply enmeshed in U.S. legacy and corporate media to the point where it becomes indistinguishable from Israeli media, except in the way that it attempts to generate consent for what Israel's doing among Americans. They use different techniques, more sensationalist techniques, and they, of course, have to appeal to liberal American sensibilities, whereas the Israeli sensibility at this point is just straightforward fascism, images of destruction and slaughter to confirm that the Israeli army is winning. So this article, this piece about CNN didn't shock me at all. And just a quick final point here. I'm sure you saw our live stream or heard about our live stream since you follow this, our little world of marginalized independent media personalities where we grilled a Washington Post reporter.
Yeah.
I mean, that was one of the reasons that I wanted to do that and was so indignant about her interview request to me, was that she herself is a committed Zionist, posing as an objective reporter covering social media for the Washington Post, and she was coming at us at the Gray Zone for doing actual investigative journalism, holding this powerful genocidal military in Israel to account, not only for killing Palestinians, but for killing Israeli citizens on October 7th. And she accused us of minimizing atrocities on October 7th for reporting on friendly fire orders from the top by Israeli officials. Today, Haaretz, the liberal Israeli newspaper, has an editorial demanding an investigation into the friendly fire killing of Israeli civilians on October 7th. So how are we the bad guys? A reporter supposed to, I mean, this is just classic punching down by the Washington Post. And so I'll take every opportunity to go after these people and expose how they have an ulterior sectarian agenda that aligns them with the apartheid entity that is guilty of the most heinous atrocities of our time, and that they are complicit in these atrocities as members of the media.
That's right. And it reminds me of the New York Times article. I know you actually just had a somewhat of a debate with Robbie on Rising about that New York Times article about the assaults that they claim happened on October 7th. And the reason why I bring that up is because I really felt like that was a desperate attempt, because I felt like Israel is actually losing the propaganda narrative in reference to the media, because the public is heavily against it. We see that with the amount of protests. The protests are still happening all across the globe. So I think this is the first time they really have to, oh my God, what are we going to do? They're not buying our PR stunt. So we have to come up with something else. Now, all of a sudden, this story emerges that there were sexual assaults that happened on October 7th while all this other stuff was going on, apparently. And to me, I'm just like, we saw the video footage of the hostages being released from Hamas. We saw hostages actually say that they were treated well. But at the same time, the state of Israel didn't want those hostages to be interviewed. Now, all of a sudden, there's this story of mass sexual assault that apparently happened on October 7th. And I'm like, you guys didn't mention this before. Then they say the witnesses don't want to be named. And so I said, how do I know these people even exist? I don't know. And there's no evidence. And so for me, one of the things I think that I've learned from the Gray Zone is that not everything is black and white. Sometimes you do have to ask these questions. Like sometimes there is that gray area. But it was interesting to me how far it seems like they're willing to go just to get, well, more so Americans, just to get the American people to side with Israel and against the Palestinian people.
Yeah, that is an excellent point. This is just about political desperation and they deployed this Hamas mass rape narrative at a time of political opportunity and desperation as liberal support began to falter for their assault. They had a lot of support, just as George W. Bush had a lot of liberal support after 9/11. Israel had a lot of liberal support after October 7th. But as the images of the dead babies and the dead women and just horror, sheer horror from the Gaza Strip start to flow in and even start to penetrate the MSNBC wine ant networks, things start to unravel, and you have to do something spectacular in order to maintain that support. So you get Sheryl Sandberg and Hillary Clinton at your Israeli mission at the UN, reliable stooges, and convince them that rape took place on a mass scale on October 7th, and then maybe you can buy a little bit more time. This is a war. Israel doesn't play by the laws of war. They don't play by any rules. All they want to do is destroy the enemy to maintain their colonial project. And their war is not fought only through military means. It's fought in the gray zone of propaganda and information warfare. And that's what this Hamas mass rape propaganda hoax is all about. And we've dismantled it at the Gray Zone. Electronic Intifada has dismantled it. Mondoweiss has dismantled it. These are independent outlets doing what journalists are supposed to do, which is to question the narratives of the powerful. And we have all the evidence we need to do so because the Israeli Social Security Service has published the names of all the dead and the circumstances of their death. It's also available at Haaretz and other public records. And we can match up those that evidence against the claims that appear, for example, in the New York Times bogus article by Jeffrey Gettleman. And it really highlights how there are no evidentiary standards for US media to print these narratives, and there is no evidentiary basis for the narratives put forward by these so-called eyewitnesses. I won't go through all the sources. I don't have time to do it. I did that yesterday on Bad Faith with Brianna Joy Gray, and we've done it at the Gray Zone. We're going to publish our questions that we're going to submit to the New York Times. But we've flipped the script on them. They thought that they could get away with this and that it would frighten people so much, especially to see it in the New York Times, and shock them so much that no one would even dare question it publicly for fear of being called rape apologists or Holocaust deniers. And we just weren't playing that, because I don't trust them. I know an Israeli official's lying when he or she is in public, when their mouth is moving, when they're typing words. And here's another lie.
It's also interesting too. This is something I pointed out to my audience recently. Notice how the narrative is this all began on October 7th. They want to dismiss the history or anything that happened prior to October 7th. They do the same thing with Russia and Ukraine, Max. They say this all started when Russia invaded Ukraine, as if nothing happened before that, as if Ukraine was not, pushing upon Russia's borders before that. They forget the Minsk Accords. They don't want to hear any of those things. And I feel, again, that's a big part of the propaganda narrative.
That's a great point. Or 9/11. Everything changed on 9/11. Remember that?
Yeah.
I mean, we are just not allowed to be historical. We are not allowed to apply context. And the only questions that we are allowed to answer are those which compel obedience to power. Do you condemn Hamas? There's only one answer to that. And when you give the answer, you obey power. And what we're saying is, our role is to just reject that paradigm and to be intelligent, and I think we're at a point now, 3 months since October 7th, where the lines are very clearly divided. There really is no gray zone here. And the people who are capable of critical thinking, skepticism, and maintain an interest and commitment to history are on one side, and the Zionists are on the other.
That's right.